One of the things I love about 60s music is the sheer variety, and when the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper, this allowed other bands to throw their hat in the ring, and this brought on a ton of diverse music. And one of the new sounds that was coming out at this time was by the band Spirit. And we're going to go into their catalog in depth here on Pop Goes the 60s. Spirit's music infuses classical, blues, folk, rock, pop, and most importantly, jazz. And they did it in a way that was accessible to most listeners at the time. Now, they had a great mentor in the band who had 25 years in the business named Ed Cassidy. Born in 1923, Ed became a professional musician at age 15 and played in 282 consecutive one-nighters in 17 states, working in show bands and on film soundtracks. He played with greats like Al Pepper, Cannonball Adderley, Roland Kirk, Lee Konitz, and Jerry Mulligan. Fast forward to 1965, and Ed Cassidy was in his early 40s, and he was in Los Angeles, and he started playing at the Ash Grove, which was a folk blues club, and it was there that he formed a group with Taj Mahal, Ry Cooder, Gary Marker, and Jesse Lee Kincaid called the Rising Suns, and they played a mix of blues and roots music. Now, Randy Wolf's uncle owned the Ash Grove, and Cass ended up dating Randy's mother, Bernice, and eventually they married not long after this. Now, Randy was a child prodigy on guitar, and because his uncle owned the Ash Grove, he got to meet many of the players that came through there and was tutored by the likes of Lightning Hopkins and some really fine players. Not too far away, two friends from the San Fernando Valley were high school buddies. This was Jay Ferguson and Mark Andes. And together they were busy in bands of their own since high school. And Jay's background was classical piano, guitar, and some banjo. And Mark Andes played guitar and bass. Now, along with Jay's brother Tom, who was an accomplished fiddle player, they formed a bluegrass band called the Oat Hill Stump Straddlers, including Mike Fondelier and Steve Fondelier. So they were basically a folk rock group at this time. And Tom Ferguson had gone to some folk camp and met Randy Wolf. And he recognized this young kid was really a fine player. And he said to his brother Jay and to Mark Andes, "You got to check this kid out." So that's when they went to the Ash Grove, and Randy occasionally was playing there. And they met Randy Wolf and decided to form a band. They formed the group the Red Roosters. This included Jay Ferguson, Mark Andes, Randy Wolf, and Mike Fondelier. And they didn't really have a drummer, so since Cass had left the Rising Suns because of a wrist injury, he eventually hooked up and helped out the boys here. So by this time he had married Randy Wolf's mother, and she said, "Well, why don't you help out the boys with their band?" So he did. He sat in with them and he became a full-time member. Now, the Red Roosters, they played folk rock basically, and they played at the Ash Grove pretty regularly. And that lasted for about 6 months until Ed Cassidy uprooted the family and headed to New York because he had secured a series of jazz gigs there. We're in 1966 now, and the move to New York City ended up being more of an important move for Randy Wolf than Ed Cassidy. And Randy was a very advanced player at a young age, and he was at a music shop in New York called Manny's, and he met a guy named Jimmy James. And they were playing a little bit on the same guitar, and James asked him to come to the show at the Cafe Wah and sit in with them. So this is how Randy Wolf met Jimmy James, Jimmy James was a stage name for Jimi Hendrix. This was his first solo gig. He was called Jimmy James and the Blue Flames. And this was a trio. The other guys in the band were bassist Randy Palmer and drummer Dan Casey. So because Randy was so good, and Jimmy, I think, wanted to have a second guitar player and to just bounce things off of and have a fuller sound. So Randy California joined right in. And because there were two Randys in the band, Randy Wolf was called Randy California and Randy Palmer was called Randy Texas. So that's how Randy California got his stage name that he used for the rest of his life. So Randy California was making $7 a night and having the time of his life, and Hendrix taught him songs like Hey Joe and Shotgun and Wild Thing. And they had a long stay at the Cafe Wah, and they started to attract some attention, as you might guess. And pretty soon you had some record company people stopping by because Hendrix was also just a star in the making, and people started to see what was going on with his playing. And the people that came by were Giorgio Gamelski, who had managed the Yardbirds, and Andrew Luke Oldham of the Stones, John Hammond, worked with Dylan. But Chaz Chandler of the Animals, who had broken up, he had been introduced to Jimi Hendrix, and he was the one that essentially began managing Hendrix. And the idea was to go back to England and to basically set the roots down there. Now, Randy California was only 15, so apparently Hendrix wanted him to go, but he was too young to go, and he ended up staying with Cass, and they very shortly after this moved back to Los Angeles. Upon moving back to LA, Cass and Randy formed another group right away with a keyboard player named John Locke, a conga player, and an upright bass player named Bob Arkin. Now, Bob Arkin is Alan Arkin's brother. Alan Arkin had been in the folk group The Terriers, so the Arkins had a musical background, and you can see how all these people just kind of mixed in, especially in the LA area. And that group didn't last very long. And very quickly, this is early '67 now, in the spring, and Jay Ferguson and Mark Andes had caught wind that Randy California was back in town. So they wanted to hook up with him again and form a new band. So now up to this point, Jay Ferguson had been in some rock bands and without much success. And Mark Andes and his brother had also been musicians, his brother Matt. Mark was in an early version of Canned Heat. And Canned Heat had just signed their contract, but Mark and Matt's father, who's a Hollywood actor, didn't want his boys to really be in the music industry or the Hollywood industry at all, and dissuaded him from continuing on with Canned Heat, was giving him a hard time. So what ended up happening is both Matt and Mark joined the live version of the group Yellow Balloon. So they did that for a little while before this opportunity came up with Randy California. The way that Jay and Mark met up with Randy is they met at the Griffith Park Love-In. And their idea was to form a rock band with Randy. But Randy was insistent upon bringing his stepfather into the group and keyboard player John Locke. So this took the sound of the band already into like a jazzier, classical direction than Jay or Mark had anticipated. So they jumped at the chance to join at a band that was going to be somewhat progressive, and that's where they started. So they briefly talked about naming themselves Spirits Rebellious after the Khalil Gibran book, but they shortened it simply to Spirit. So let's do a quick rundown of the band here. We have Ed Cassidy on drums and percussion. We have Randy California on guitar and vocals. We have Jay Ferguson on vocals and percussion. Now, Jay also played piano and guitar, banjo, but he typically didn't play those instruments within the band here. Left the guitar work to Randy and the keyboard work to John Locke. So Locke played piano and keyboard, and then Mark Andes played bass and backing vocals. Now, all these guys were pretty seasoned players, so they locked in together with one another very quickly. And they created a unique sound with California's fluid playing and John Locke's slightly avant-garde keyboards. And then you add Ferguson's surreal lyrics to that, and they fit right into the whole kind of psychedelic scene. Now, they played the Topanga Corral, and that was a place where the crowd really loved them. Buffalo Springfield would show up to see them, Taj Mahal and guys from the Rising Suns. And they also played the Ash Grove, so they built up a very good following there as well. Now, bands like this were drawing the attention of lots of different labels, and RCA was one of the early labels that looked at Spirit, but they were looking for like boy-girl songs, and I mean, this band was anything but that. Because they played more jazz, a jazzier approach, I think they scared off some labels because it just wasn't commercial enough sounding. Who was gonna really buy this stuff? We saw with the Rising Suns, that music didn't really catch on commercially, although it was great live. Spirit might have been cut out of a similar cloth. But luckily for them, Lou Adler had come by and took an interest in the group, and he had just started a new label called Ode, and he needed acts for that label. We're in the summer of 1967 now, and the first single released on Ode was San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Some Flowers in Your Hair, that song by Scott McKenzie. So that was written by John Phillips and all this Summer of Love stuff started going on. So the band was kind of coming in at the right time. And the guy that hooked up Spirit with Adler was Brian Barry, was the brother of singer Jan Barry. And he heard him rehearsing and set the stage for an audition with Lou Adler. Now, Jan's other brother, Ken, arranged for the band to do a demo for Adler. So anyway, the meeting went really well. They did a audition for them, for Adler at the Whiskey A Go-Go. Now, Lou Adler had some clout around this time, obviously. Having worked with the Grassroots and the Mamas and the Papas, he was just starting to work on the Monterey Pop Festival. And he realized that the band, vocally wasn't that strong, but as players, they were super hot players. So he thought, well, yeah, I can do something with this group. And even though the band auditioned for other bigger labels, they went with Adler, and Adler signed them to a 4-LP deal. Now that's pretty impressive, getting signed to a 4-album deal right off the bat. And when they signed the contract, I think most of the band members were minors, so parents had to be involved. Obviously, Cass was in his 40s. And Mark Andy said this of Lou Adler. He said, "Adler was respected and ruthless, but he didn't nurture us. We signed the week before Adler organized the Monterey Pop Festival. He could have put us on. It was a missed opportunity because we were part of a thriving LA scene." So on this thriving LA scene, they were opening for Cream and they were playing with the Byrds, and they didn't have an album out. So, maybe Adler didn't want to push them out there too soon without an album to sell after they're, on a big stage like the Monterey Pop Festival. However, there was a group that did do that, and that was the Electric Flag. I think their very first gig was at the Monterey Pop Festival, and it took them months to get an album out, but I mean, who would quibble over such minor things here? If you had the opportunity to be in front of that audience, maybe you push your new band out there. So Adler chose not to do that. So in the second half of 1967, the band started working on their first album, and that's this, the self-titled album, Spirit. Fresh Garbage became one of their early signature songs, and Uncle Jack was more of a pop rock song that was sung by Mark. And finally, Girl in Your Eye was a little more psychedelic, so you had a little sitar plunking around there in the background. All those three songs were written by Jay Ferguson.
Protector of the lame, straight and low is his name. And a gramophone mind that wants what you bring. What a woman will live on love, swim to the bottom and never come up.
Now, Straight Arrow was about Mark Andy's father, Keith, and who was by this time a television actor. Gramophone Man was a song about one of their failed record contracts that they were trying to sign. That was a band composition. And then Water Woman is a pretty solid pop psychedelic song that was covered by a couple of British bands, namely The Amazing Friendly Apple and Pacific Drift. That first piece was Elijah, and that was one of the centerpieces of their live show where they did a lot of improvisation. They could stretch out on that song a lot. Meanwhile, the next song, which was also an instrumental, is called Taurus. Now, Taurus is most notable because it, shall we say, influenced Led Zeppelin in the song Stairway to Heaven. Well, the finger picking that Randy California is doing at the beginning of Taurus is note for note the same as some of the guitar intro in Stairway to Heaven. And then John Locke's harpsichord is basically, you hear that in the melody of the song when Robert Plant starts singing. So this became an issue many years later. But at the time, it was, this stuff happened all the time. You had people lifting pieces of songs here and there. There are just ways you do it that you don't lift too much of it. And this became an issue later. But Zeppelin were big fans of Spirit, and they did a version of Fresh Garbage in their live shows. And they looked at this as more of an homage to the band. Now, that last song you heard is called Mechanical World, and that was actually released as the band's first single. and it actually charted it on the Bubbling Under chart at number 123, which is surprising to be charted at all. It is a difficult song to listen to, actually. It's as uncommercial as you can get, but the reason it was released as a single is Adler didn't know what to release as a single off the album, and there are plenty of other more commercial options. So what they did is they left it to what the FM radio stations would choose. And apparently the FM channel took a long song that was very progressive and at the time very outside the norm. So that's why that song was chosen to release as their first single, and it did very poorly. So not sure why Adler went that direction, but he wouldn't make that same mistake twice. All right, so this is the first album, and very nice photography. And it's all written by the band. And some of the strings and orchestration you hear were done by Marty Paich, who was one of the top arrangers in the business. And I think it made the album more commercial and more professional sounding, but the band didn't care for that much. Here's what Jay Ferguson had to say. Lou was a strong personality, and on the first two albums I thought he was fine. Although when we heard our debut album and discovered he'd gotten Marty Paich to orchestrate the songs, fundamentally changing our sound, our jaws hit the floor. Now here's what Randy California said. My problem wasn't using Paich, who had worked with Frank Sinatra and Mel Torme, but what happened to the overall sound. Paich didn't come cheap, so we paid for that. Plus Adler took the balls and guts out of what we had done. I didn't recognize half of it. So I think that this album, which sounds slightly avant-garde to me and really pushing the boundaries, I think Paich's orchestrations brought it a little bit down to earth a little bit. If they took some of the balls out of it, I never really noticed. I think it still sounds pretty heavy to me, but I can understand that it would have been very different than what they were doing live. So they had a bit of a problem with it. Now this album got to number 31. So this was actually the dawn of the FM band, where you had all these albums not charting, but getting airplay on the FM dial as opposed to the AM dial. So Spirit kind of helped invent the success of the FM dial with albums like this. The band was doing quite a lot of touring at this time, pushing the sales of the album, and they played with several other up-and-coming bands. Pleased with the results and the direction the band was going and the success they were having, Adler decided, well, we need a hit single now, all of a sudden. So he pressured the band to write something that was more commercial, and Randy California came up with the song I Got a Line on You. They held off on releasing I Got a Line on You until closer to the second album was ready for release, but I Got a Line on You got to number 25. Meanwhile, they were working on this album, The Family That Plays Together, that came out in late 1968. So with The Family That Plays Together, this album was a little harder hitting. They regained some of that heavy sound, which makes this album basically a progressive rock album. And some of that heavy sound I would attribute to Mark Andy's bass playing. So there's a lot of bottom on these songs, and they still maintain that kind of psychedelic feel that was pervasive in the industry. It didn't sound cliche like a lot of the other bands that were trying to become psychedelic. These guys were forging new psychedelic territory, and you hear that on this record. So the song A Dream Within a Dream is clearly a pretty psychedelic song. So all the psychedelic, if you're a psychedelic fan, you're going to like this album and all the material, really. Now this album was a gatefold with some nice photography in the middle, some black and whites in color. And as you can see, we've got Cass here in the front. And what's interesting about the band's spirit at this time was the most visual guy in the band was Ed Cassidy. And at a time when the long-haired youth were dressing as hippies, here you had basically an old beatnik with a shaved head wearing black leather. So it was a very striking look behind that drum kit, and that helped them stand out, at least from the other bands. Despite the album's psychedelic leanings, they also stretched further into jazz. The Family That Plays Together hit number 22 on the Billboard album chart, so that's even better than the first album. So that's a pretty solid showing for this record. They did have the single helping to push it a little bit, because I Got a Lot on You did well. But many of the songs on this album, they crossfade with one another, and it gives the whole album a thematic feel. And even though Marty Page does do the arrangements on this, like he did on the first album, it doesn't lose that heavy sound that they had live. During the recording of this album, a few songs went unreleased, like the instrumental Fog, written by John Locke and Ed Cassidy. Fog is a great example of one of their atmospheric instrumentals, and I love this song, and even though it wasn't used originally or released on the album, it gave Lou Adler the idea to maybe set them up with some soundtrack work. So they got set up with a French director named Jacques Demy for the film The Model Shop. Now, this was Demy's first English-speaking film, and the band got to do the soundtrack for this. Now, the work they did on this album was mostly instrumental, with the exception of these two songs. The soundtrack turned out to be the perfect foil for the band's ambient soundscapes. And one cool thing about this is that all these songs that they were working on were done collaboratively. So on the first album, it was mostly written by Jay Ferguson, and then Randy California, when he got the hit song with I Got a Line on You, he started to contribute more as well. But on the soundtrack work here, the band all got credit for all the songs. In addition to creating the music for the film, the band also has a cameo. And one of the songs on here that's a favorite of mine is called Coral. Mark Andes maintained that the Model Shop was basically John Locke's finest playing in spirit. He said he was getting to John Cage and we flew off the walls. Now, I think this is a really good soundtrack, and this is what it would have looked like perhaps had it been released. But the film came out in early 1969 and was a complete flop. So the record company's thinking like, well, why should we spend the money releasing a soundtrack that probably isn't going to sell because the film isn't around to push it? So this was released many years later by Sundazed, but I think this has got some of their finest work on it. I love this record, and I would highly suggest seeking that one out. Their advancement in the studio was mirrored with their work on stage, as Randy California brandished his clear Perspex Stratocaster and Ed Cassidy expanded his kit, including orchestral and symphonic bass drums that are generally used in classical music. So it wasn't long before they were getting invited to the pop festivals that were starting to become big in 1968. They played the Atlanta Pop Festival that summer. They released a new single that was from the forthcoming album, Clear.
Dark-eyed woman on a hot summer night. Dark-eyed woman, are you burning tonight?
Dark-Eyed Woman was a great collaboration between Ferguson and California, but in an effort to kind of repeat the success of I Got a Line on You, this song only got to number 118. And it's not that commercial. I mean, this band is obviously geared for the FM dial and for live performances and for that kind of progressive hard rock crowd. Now, this album was the next one. This came out in 1969, Clear. And this album sounds a little bit derivative. You know, they were in the soundtrack mode. So the Clear album has got some long instrumentals as well, but a very good mix of hard rock songs too.
I said too much business is wrong for you, baby. Just a little bit longer. I'm talking, baby. Sweet Miss Matty, would you go with me? Hey, yeah. A little Miss.
Now in those songs you can hear the rock roots, but they also offer some lighthearted psych.
Although I question if it's just give a life, take a life. I'll just sing the song of love for everyone.
Now that last song was the instrumental Ice. That was a John Locke song. So that sounds a little bit like what they had been doing on the Model Shop soundtrack, which they were kind of in that mode of thinking. So they were doing those more stretched out, longer instrumentals. And that was one of them. This album is certainly their least commercial album compared to the first two anyway. It only got to number 55. Now the band continued to be a solid live attraction and were starting to get invited to pop festivals. And one they were invited to was Woodstock. And because Hendrix was going, they were tight with Jimi Hendrix, and especially Randy California was, the idea was then for Spirit to open up for Hendrix's set. But Lou Adler nixed the idea. He wanted them out on the road pushing the Clear album and not spending so much time at these long drawn-out pop festivals. By the way, the pop festival was somewhat created by Lou Adler, so I find that very hard to believe, but apparently that's what the reasoning was for them not going to Woodstock. The Lou Adler partnership was coming to an end here, and it wasn't really acrimonious necessarily, but there was the end of the distribution deal with the old label with Epic. So the band still owed one album, and what happened was the band was just given to Epic. Meanwhile, Adler retained Ode and kept Carole King with him for that. So the band didn't have Adler anymore as a producer, and they decided to produce themselves for their next single. 1984 only made it to number 69 on the Billboard charts, and the band felt that, well, maybe it was too political. It's not that commercial sounding. It did well on the FM dial and was on the Billboard Top 100 for 9 weeks, so I think that's a fairly decent showing for a song with that lacked that much of a melody, I guess. So the band continued to tour, and they did their first European tour around this time. And this is in February of 1970. And they were really surprised at how many fans they had there. I had mentioned earlier there was a couple of bands that had covered the song Water Woman. That was off their first album. Obviously Zeppelin loved the band, so they had a strong following in Europe. They sold out the Lyceum Theatre in London, headlining over Joe Cocker and the Bonzo Dog Band. Jay Ferguson lamented that that show at the Lyceum Theatre may have been their best live show ever, and he said that the response from the audience and press was tremendous. This tour also marked a time of harmony within the band. Now, unfortunately, this harmony wouldn't last long. After the European tour, they got back home and got down to business, but the first thing they had to do was get a new producer. So they hired David Briggs, who was working with Neil Young at the time. He had just done Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. That's Neil Young's second album. And Neil Young was friends with the band. So he said, why don't you try David Briggs? So Briggs came in, and he was a welcome addition because he treated the band members kind of like equals. Adler was a little bit more of a boss type of a guy. And this started out very good for the band. And all ideas were heard, and there was a lot of camaraderie. Despite him treating the band members as equals, most of the band's first 3 studio albums took 5-6 weeks to complete, but this album took 6 months to complete. Now this is the album, The 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus, and it gets off to a very quick start. Here's what Ferguson says of the recording of this album. There was a constant push-pull of ideas. Sparks were always flying. It made for great music and great performances, but was ultimately exhausting. So by this time, their 4th album, they were playing really well together. They had their sound down. They had this progressive rock sound that had been going on for a couple of years in the industry. They had been purveyors of it. And I would say on this album, this is a little more rock-oriented as opposed to the jazzier stuff of the prior albums. This is really what their finest album was. Most people consider this their high watermark. And since I got the album up here, let me just talk a little bit about the cover. They have this interesting photography with this waviness that distorts the photos. Cassidy's got this face paint on. We see more of that on in this inner gatefold. As Ferguson alluded to earlier, things were getting exhausting. This album took a long time to record, and one of the things that made this maybe a little bit different for them is that David Briggs was kind of in the Hollywood milieu, and he started introducing him to this Hollywood jet set, the bigger parties, the harder drugs. So this is where cocaine comes in a little heavier, whereas prior it was marijuana and LSD, which were considered soft drugs. Well, in this case, cocaine had entered the picture, and things started getting a little bit, shall we say, paranoid. Now, one of the things that happened during the recording of this album, there was some friction between Jay Ferguson and Randy California, jockeying for who's writing the songs. On the first album, Ferguson wrote most of the songs, but since then, the 2 singles that charted were done by Randy California. So they had a clash of ideas. The way that California preferred to mold the band was more from the live perspective and doing more improvisational stuff on stage, whereas Ferguson liked tighter sets on stage, more predictable, I guess you could just say more commercial. Jay Ferguson wasn't playing instruments on stage other than percussion, so he wasn't able to contribute in the same way California could with his style of playing. So that was an issue. John Locke was typically the diplomat and the peacemaker of the group, but the idea that David Briggs allowed everybody to be equal was in contrast to how Lou Adler handled things. If there was conflict, Adler could kind of put his foot down and say, okay, we're going to go in this direction and here's why. That was one of the good things that Adler brought to the studio with this band. They could record more quickly, and they got over their disagreements more quickly as well. Now, making matters worse, near the end of the recording of this album, Randy California had a fall off his horse and fractured his skull. And in the recovery, he was still kind of partying a bit. So what the guys say retrospectively is that California wasn't really the same after that fall. Now, despite all the problems with the album and some of the conflicts between members, they knew this was their best work. The problem was it only charted at number 63. This was their lowest charting album of all their 4 albums. And they didn't understand how they could work so hard and create something they felt was their best and have it be their lowest charting album. So this was starting to creep into the band's psyche, and they were just starting to lose confidence and just lose steam, and that camaraderie started to break down. In addition to the disappointing album chart, the band released 3 singles from this album that also charted poorly.
Hey, got too much to lose, got to get on back to the animal zoo. Hey, I'll raise my head in a touchy situation. It's not scary, nowhere to be. Nature's way telling you something's wrong.
Now, I've always been surprised that Nature's Way didn't crack like the top 40. I mean, such a great song, one of their signature songs. And I'm not sure why. Maybe Epic wasn't promoting it as much, but really they had the clout and they've been around enough and been touring enough that you would have thought that a song like that would chart. And it was a commercial song. So they just couldn't find any success on the charts. This album did take a long time to record, so that eats up some of the profits as well. So the money wasn't coming in, because if you're spending time in the studio, that has to be paid back to the record company via tours or however you pay it back. So the money wasn't coming in, and Randy California started to go slightly off the rails here, coked out of his mind and starting to have visions. And he thought that Andes and Ferguson were plotting against him. And this led to California completely canceling one of the tours to Japan. The night before they were supposed to leave, he said, "I'm not going to go." So Andes and Ferguson, I think, realized that the end was near here. And Andy said that Randy stopped acting rationally. He wanted too much control of my life. Now, in June 1971, Mark and Jay called a band meeting and formally quit the band. And they had already been rehearsing a new band they called JoJo Gunn, and that they formed with Mark's brother Matt. And meanwhile, California went to rehab and eventually moved to Hawaii. Now, Randy California always claimed that this album was done dirty by the Rolling Stone magazine, and that gave him a bad review and helped break up the band, and that attributed to low sales and or poor chart success. But what he's talking about is Nick Torches, who's the critic. Actually, that review is a pretty fair review. I would say it's pretty well balanced. It's not a negative review really at all. So that's a myth that is perpetuated. This album, though it only charted at number 63, actually won gold. It took 5 years to do it, but it was a slow burn, and it sold slowly through the next several years and was always the band's best-selling record. You would think this would be the end of the band, having lost your lead guitarist, your 2 main songwriters, and your bass player in Ferguson, Andes, and California. But the band carried on. So John Locke and Ed Cassidy added the Stahaley brothers, Al and Chris, on bass and guitar, and they carried on with this album called Feedback. Now, this didn't come out till early 1972, and again we had David Briggs producing.
A slap on the ass and a hard handshake. Hey John, how you been? Lost my lady and my job last week. Said John.
Now, this was recorded about 6 months after Ferguson and Andes left the band in November 71, released in March of 72. The first single, Cadillac Cowboys, did not chart. And these songs don't really sound like Spirit. I mean, had they had Randy California's guitar playing in here, you might have made the argument that, hey, this really sounds like the band, and his playing was so unique. But in this case, it doesn't really sound much like the band at all. Now, where it does show hints of the old Spirit are in some of the John Locke songs.
In the darkness of
Now those three songs are mostly instrumental, and they do sound a bit like the old Spirit, but really that's not enough, I don't think. Now this album, I wouldn't consider this to be a essential part of their catalog. It's a full-fledged Spirit album. I think it's probably more for completists. It has its charms, but it's not really on the level of the other four albums at all. Now what was obvious to everybody else eventually became obvious to Locke and Cassidy, and they ended up quitting the band in the middle of the tour for this album, which tells you something. So anyway, that left the Staheley brothers to reform under a different name, and that seemed like the end of the band. Meanwhile, Ferguson and Andes, along with Mark's brother Matt, they formed JoJo Gunn and had the hit with Run, Run, Run. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, Sardonicus was kind of an album that sold over a long time and was on the charts for a long time. And in 1972, Mr. Skin was released as a single, and that charted at number 92. Not very high, but it still charted. So there was still life in the Spirit world, and in 1973, they came up with their first Best Of album. Now, this is a great compilation. And this charted at number 119 on the top 200 chart. So that's not too bad for a group that wasn't around anymore and around a tour and kind of fizzled out. So this album was a longtime seller as well. Okay, so we're 1972 here. So we got Feedback that's out. We've got this album that comes out in 73. Epic ends up re-releasing two double albums. Here's an example of one. This is The Family That Plays Together and Feedback. And then they released another one that was the first and the third albums. The first and the third album, just called Spirit, that charted at number 191. So it's interesting how these were still selling, and they never, 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus remained in print as what it was, because that was also still selling. So you had basically all of their albums out selling again, and 3 of the 5 charting. As the 70s wore on and the 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus inched its way toward gold status in 1976, Randy California regrouped and did 2 albums under the Spirit moniker, Spirit of 76 and The Son of Spirit. And I always felt that it was strange how California never forged a solo career for himself, always reverting back to the crutch of the band name and the band atmosphere of Spirit. And I thought that never really served him well. The next album was a legitimate reunion album, save for Jay Ferguson. This is called Farther Along. And California is on this one, and it sounds like a Spirit album. And fans really love this album. They're very warm to this record. They do a very nice orchestrated version of Nature's Way. And although Ferguson didn't participate on this album, he was on a live show at the Santa Monica Civic Center in 1977. And that went over really well. That was the first full band reunion, live anyway, and that was a really good experience. And unfortunately, it didn't really go beyond that. By 1978, Jay Ferguson was already having hits, and he had the big hit Thunder Island. Randy California and Ed Cassidy continued to collaborate on projects, and then there was a second reunion album in 1984 called The 13th Dream. And unfortunately, that was the last time they really got together. Randy California died in a drowning accident in Hawaii, rescuing his son in the ocean. So his son was rescued, but Randy did not make it. And that was the spiritual end of Spirit. So all of Spirit's material is available for purchase, most on vinyl and CD as well. Let me just show you here. This is a compilation that I bought in 1991. Time Circle. I was really waiting for something like this. So this is a good mix of all their material on those first 4 albums. Some of the unreleased Model Shop stuff is also on here. It's got a good little booklet in here and story of the band. So this is very cool, some good photos. This is called Time Circle, 1968 to 1972. As I mentioned, the Model Shop, let me pull that out again here. The Model Shop is available. I'm not sure if it's in print anymore. This is by Sundazed. So Sundazed always does a great job on reissues. The sound is excellent on this one. If you can't find the Model Shop on vinyl, you should be able to find it on CD. So both are good. And if you can't find those, there's another Sunday's comp called Eventide. This is essentially most of the tracks from Model Shop, plus a couple B-sides that weren't released on album. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Spirit. You know, one of the more eclectic bands that came out of Los Angeles in the late 60s. And again, like I mentioned with the Rising Suns, a lot of bands in the 60s, particularly in California, were given a shot, even though they weren't commercial and they were a completely new sound. Spirit falls into this category, and they were given a 4-album deal. And they did 5 albums. So I think that's really impressive. And they had a great sound. Kind of the secret sauce of this band, I guess, was California's guitar playing. As I mentioned, Mark Andy's heavy bass playing, and Locke and Cassidy added an awful lot atmospherically to this group's material, as well as Ferguson's lyrics. So they had a really good group going. The one thing they did not have a strong vocalist. That may have accounted for some of the lack of chart success. If they had a really great singer, it's no telling where this band could have gone or what they would have done. But as it turns out, Randy California died rather young, and that was very sad because some of his best work may have been ahead of him. So that is my band history on Spirit. If you'd like to support this channel in a bigger way, I have several ways to do that. We've got a tip jar below. There is a way to join my Patreon subscribers, and you can give monthly to that. And of course, there's merchandise on my website. And I always mention that subscribing is free, so I'm always looking to build those subscribers. So all your support in any way you can give it is always appreciated. And we'll see you back here very soon for another band history on Pop Goes the 60s.